Today's topic of discussion is formal interruptions in parliamentary debate. Now, in parley, it's a very common experience for debaters to want to interrupt their opponents. Maybe your opponents have introduced new information illegally in a rebuttal speech. Maybe they have misinterpreted your case. Regardless, there are ways of interrupting your opponents in a way that doesn't come off as impolite. During your opponent's speech, you can formally intervene with a question or statement, and doing so is called raising a point. Now, there are 4 different kinds of points. You can raise a point of information, a point of clarification, a point of personal privilege, or a point of order. Let's begin with a point of information. Now, a point of information is where you ask a question to make your opponents look bad in some capacity. So, when do you raise a point of information, oftentimes abbreviated to a POI? Well, first of all, you have to ask it during a constructive speech, which, as you may remember, is the first 4 speeches of the round. So in the last 2 rebuttal speeches, it is against the rules to raise a POI. It also has to be in your opponent's speeches, so you cannot call a POI on your own partner. Finally, it has to be during unprotected time. Now, protected time is a certain period of time during every speech in which you are not allowed to be interrupted. This is the first minute and the last minute. So unprotected time would be in the very first speech, minute 2 to minute 6, and so on. Now, there are different ways to raise a POI. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are now both tournaments in person and online. So let's begin by discussing how you can raise a POI in person. Well, you begin by standing up. The second step is to alert your opponents. You can do so in a number of ways. For instance, you can raise your hand or you could stop. If you want to raise your hand, the actual original way to do so would be to put one hand on your head and raise the other hand, simply because this is simulating members of parliament, and so you would be holding onto your wig. But that formality has gone out of fashion as of right now. Then you wait to be acknowledged by your opponents. Online, there are 3 different ways you could raise a POI. You could raise your virtual hand and wait for your opponents to call on you. You can unmute and verbally call out the word POI, or you could type the word POI into the chat and wait for your opponents to call on you. Regardless, it would be good for you to discuss how to call POIs in tournaments before the round, both with the judge and with your opponents, just to make sure that you're all clear and you all know what to look for. Now, here's an important note. Your opponents may or may not accept your POI. Your opponents may say, I do not accept your POI. They may say, sure, what do you have on your mind? They may say, I'll get you at the end of my flow. I'll get you at the end of my argument. I'll get you at the end of my point, etc. It's their decision because it's their time. So here are good examples of POIs. If you ask a true or false question, if you ask a multiple choice question, or if you ask a short answer question. The ultimate intention is to trip your opponents up and to look good to the judge. Plan how you will use each possible answer to your advantage. For instance, say you ask a true or false question. Well, note that if your opponents say true, you will use that against them. If they say false, you will use that against them. Good POIs are double binds. Even if your opponents do not accept your POI, in your next speech you can get up and say, Judge, this is the POI that was not accepted. Had they said yes, then this would have happened. Had they said no, then this would have happened, etc. There are many different strategies for POIs. Here are just some common ones. You could set up an argument. You could make your opponent's answer for a hard issue. You could even expose a nasty edge in your opponent's philosophy. For instance, say the resolution is this House should deny organ transplants to people who lead bad or unhealthy lifestyles. Now you could, on the opposition side, raise a POI against the government side and say, for example, should we deny organ transplants to long-haul truck drivers? Now let's look at what we're doing. First of all, we're setting up an argument and saying that certain professions will be discriminated against. We're making our opponent's answer for a hard issue, and that's that, once again, certain professions will not allow for people to receive organ transplants. We're also exposing a nasty edge in our opponent's philosophy. You could also expose your opponent's ignorance by asking them about a topic that they probably won't know a lot about. Note that this strategy only works if you ask a question that they really should know about, as a well-read individual. For example, if you are on the opposition side and the government side has passed a plan, you could say, okay, raise a POI and ask, how did this plan work in this foreign country, for example? However, it is not a viable POI to ask, what was the GDP of this country in this year? That is not reasonable information that a well-read individual would be expected to know, and thus it's not a good POI, and it won't look bad to the judge if they trip up. Okay, so here are some examples of some bad POIs. All of them, as you'll notice, are vague and do not actually contribute to the intellectual discussion. For instance, don't you think you're wrong? Or wouldn't you agree with this argument? You could even say, actually, my argument was blank, or even ask if your opponents have a source. In all cases, you're clearly just asking a POI to ask a POI. You're not contributing to the intellectual discussion, and you're not being specific. Note that the third option isn't even a question. Many debaters will actually say statements and not questions, which looks bad because that's not the intention of a POI. It always has to be a question. Okay, so if the intention of a POI is to trip up your opponents, why would you even accept a POI? It is, after all, sucking up your time. Well, if your opponents are trying to trip you up and then you answer really well, it looks good. So now the question is, how do you respond well to a POI? Well, here are some good ways to respond. First of all, you could deny the premise of the POI entirely. You could also shift the focus away from the POI to another topic that benefits you. Thirdly, you could rebuttal the argument that your opponents are implying. So, if you may remember, let's return back to the strategies that debaters like to use for POIs. Well, note that a lot of debaters like to use the very first strategy, set up an argument. And so, what you could do is you could predict or foresee the argument that your opponents are trying to say, and then completely deny it or rebuttal it. This is good because you're cutting to the chase, as you can oftentimes predict the kind of argumentation that your opponents are going to make. Here are some bad responses to a POI. The first one is just saying that it's not relevant. Obviously, if they're raising that question, it is relevant to the round. You could also say, my partner will answer this later, which is once again not a viable response because you're clearly backed into a corner and don't know what to say. Finally, claiming that your opponents have not raised a question is not a good response. After all, while some opponents may forget that POIs are supposed to be questions, the fundamental argumentation that they bring up will still stand and will still need to be refuted. Pointing out that it's not structured in a question doesn't in any way help your case. Okay, so the second kind of point that you can call is called a point of clarification, in which you ask a question to clarify the round. Now, the fundamental difference between a POC and a POI is that in a POI, you're being competitive and trying to trip your opponents up. In a POC, you're being friendly. All you want is a clearer, better round for everyone. Here's an example of a POC. You could ask, can you repeat this? For instance, if your opponents just stated a definition, a weighing mechanism, maybe a plan text, and you didn't catch it, it's important that you ask this POC because it's important that you still get that information. For instance, sorry, can you repeat your plan text? Another viable question is, where are you on the flow? It would be pretty hard to flow your opponents if you don't know if they're on disadvantage 2 or advantage 1. So this is also a good question to clarify the round. It can also help the judge, as the judge may be wondering the same thing. When do you ask a POC? Well, you ask it at the same time when you ask a POI. So like POIs, you can ask them during constructive speeches, during your opponent's speeches, and during unprotected time. In person, same instructions as a POI. You stand up, you alert your opponents, and you wait to be acknowledged. And online, same thing, you raise your virtual hand, you can unmute, or you can type it in the chat. Now, note that not all tournaments accept POCs, and so you want to read the tournament handbook before you compete. Here's the fundamental difference between POIs and POCs. Your opponents must accept your POC. It's against the rules not to. This is because once they accept it, the time is actually paused for you to ask your question and then for your opponents to respond. Then the time resumes after the POC has been addressed and the debate continues. Especially because it's friendly, they must be accepted. Thirdly, we have point of orders. which is a statement, not a question, saying that your opponents have introduced new information and a rebuttal speech. Well, remember that in the two rebuttal speeches, the last two speeches of the round, it is against the rules to introduce new information. And so if you hear your opponents doing so, it's important that you call it out with a point of order, or a POO. When? You can ask it at any point in your opponent's rebuttal speech. Now, whenever you want to call a POI or a POO, you begin by verbally calling POO or point of order. Then you wait for the judge to acknowledge you. You state the violation, and then your opponents point out where they previously stated this information. Finally, the judge makes a ruling. There are three different ways that the judge could rule. They could say point well taken, which means that they agree with the POO and that your opponents must proceed without the argument. Point under consideration means that the judge is not quite sure if your opponents have previously stated it, and so they say proceed with caution. And the final one is point not well taken, and that the judge does not agree with the POO, believes that your opponents have previously stated this information, and thus are allowing your opponents to continue with the argument. Now, here's some things to be aware of. It's absolutely necessary that after 3 POOs, you stop calling them, because it comes off as impolite, especially if the judge rules point not well taken. It's also important to consider that POOs are serious offenses, as you are accusing your opponents of violating parliamentary debate rules. And so because of it, only call a POO if you are 100% sure that your opponents are somehow being abusive and that they're introducing a significant argument that they have in no way alluded to previously in the round. Important. Please remember that a POO applies to new arguments. Your opponents are allowed to bring up new examples and statistics to support points that they have previously made. They are also allowed to logically extend off points that they have previously made. The only thing they are not allowed to do is introduce entirely new arguments that they have not alluded to earlier in the round. Finally, we have points of personal privilege. These are by far the least common. I've never seen one in my entire career as a debater. There are statements claiming that your opponents have personally offended you. So if your opponents offend people of your ethnicity, people who live where you are, people of your religion, etc., you are allowed to call a point of personal privilege. You are only allowed to call a point of personal privilege if the offense specifically applies to you. Let's go over some review. We begin with the POI, or a question to throw your opponents off. These are by far the most common. Or it could have a POC, a point of clarification, or a question to make the round clearer. Point of orders are the second most common. They are statements that essentially state that your opponents have introduced new information in a rebuttal speech. And finally, a point of personal privilege is the least common. It is a statement stating that your opponents have personally offended you. Please proceed with caution when it comes to points of personal privilege, as they can look whiny. Only address them if you truly do feel personally offended.